There is no doubt that in recent decades, British politicians, particularly at the national level, have wanted to offer us Swedish or German levels of public services, but with America's tax levels. And that's not a sustainable model. You can borrow for a bit, you can deliver efficiency savings for a bit to try to make it look as if we're going to get much, much better public services than we're willing to pay for. But in the end, it can't go on like that. So what we're now seeing is a period of adjustment when we're going to have to cut back the scale of the public sector. And until and unless politicians could put up the level of taxes beyond the kind of levels that they've bumped along in for several years, we're left with this kind of position.
Well, we do a lot of work with councils at NLGN, so obviously we've been out discussing the spending review with them. I think the honest response is that people aren't very surprised by this. It feels very much like a continuation of the current spending review. So the cuts continue at roughly the same rate. Most councils had already anticipated that. So no big shift of direction there. What is interesting, I think, is you're seeing the government, rhetorically at least, putting a lot of emphasis on community budgets. So this is where councils try and pool money with, say, the NHS to redesign services. There are some big savings in there. The government's support is rhetorically fulsome. In policy terms, it's a bit more lukewarm. But I think councils are excited about the possibility of rolling that approach out a lot further.
I think councils will decide, and it'll be different for different councils, they'll decide to pull out some services and perhaps to ration others, maybe even charge for some as well. There are different ways of dealing with the budgetary pressures, but certainly there are core services that they have to provide, so those statutory services will be maintained.
Well, councils have worked with the private sector for centuries, and certainly we've had some very big partnerships with business over the last couple of decades, many of which have been fairly successful. What's becoming clear is that councils don't want those kind of partnerships anymore. They don't want big 10-year deals. They probably don't even want 5-year deals. What they're looking for from the private sector is a lot more innovation and more risk-taking.
The deficit problem that we've learned about in the last few years is not going to go away between now and even the end of the decade, 2020. And as a result of that, it's going to mean that the next government spends a lot of its time fighting to bring down the deficit, and that even they may not get it down to zero by the end of the decade. And what this means is a long-term adjustment as the state shrinks, and within it some services, for example local government, apparently have to shrink more than the average, and we will have to expect less of the state.
I think when we're looking going forward now, we know there's going to be a total of 6 or 7 years of cuts at least, and I think that's meaning some very difficult choices that essentially when you get to something like 50% of the budget, we need to look at new ways of delivering services rather than just cutting it and reshaping actually a whole council.
I do think local authorities can be more innovative in future around the services they deliver. I think it's essential that they do become more innovative, and I think there's a question in my mind about capability. Innovation is not an easy thing. I mean, I think if you ask private sector companies, relatively few are really, really good at innovation and really have it built into their DNA. So it's unlikely that many public sector organisations will have that capability already, so they're going to have to learn.
Well, councils have gotten this far without doing anything terribly transformative. That's not to say it's been easy. They've sacked a lot of staff, they've restructured their management teams, but if you look at most councils, they're fundamentally the same shape they were in 2010, just a lot smaller. They probably can't keep that up over the next 3 or 4 years. You look at some of the big counties, they're assuming that by 2018, their budget will be as much as 40 or 50% smaller than in 2010. You can't make those kind of cuts without doing something pretty drastic. Fundamentally, we're going to have to find something really, really big if we're not just going to cut services back, and it's not clear what that is yet.
I think it may be exactly the same, because we may find that we don't get the bravery from central government to give local government the powers it needs to be. But I think we need to go back to the roots of local government. They were the authorities that created our cities. They were the people that put investment into roads and transport to make the populations grow and flourish. And we saw dramatic changes across the country between conurbations because they did or didn't make that choices. And there'll be two real core questions. One will be what kind of services will be provided for people in the local authority, and that's in the social care end, and how will they be provided, and what will be the role of local government in guaranteeing those services rather than providing themselves. And I kind of put it, the second question will be around economic development and business developments, and that won't be true for all authorities. Certainly will be true for an authority like Haringey in a city London. Where the real question will be what's our role in stimulating growth ourselves and making sure that we're pulling the levers, able to borrow the money to make sure that we're investing and bringing jobs into borough. Both of those things are about a local government that is, I guess for want of a better phrase, steering and not rowing.